The 2025 budget has landed, and some of it was good, some of it was very bad, and Rachel Reeves continues to ignore several elephants in the room. I'm Jamie from Accounts, and here's my analysis of the 2025 budget. So, full disclosure, I am losing money from this budget. I'm luckily enough a higher earner. I'm a millennial. I don't have any kids. I do have an electric vehicle. And Reeves has found several ways into my pocket. And actually, I'm fine with that. The two-child benefit cap lift matters more than my marginal rate. But that doesn't mean this is a good budget, or even an honest one. But let's talk about the good. So Rachel Reeves deserves credit where it's due. Lifting the two-child benefit cap will hopefully pull 450,000 children in the UK out of poverty. This is overdue, but it is happening, and that matters. At least Labour also seem to be willing to make a moral argument against the Tories and reform on this. Less noticed, but equally welcome, is an increase to tax on unearned income. So dividend tax up 2%, property income getting separate rates from 27, 22% basic, 42% higher, 47% additional. And this is kind of what progressive taxation looks like, asking those with investment income to contribute more. Although there is a big risk that a lot of this will be avoided when people shift their portfolios to create capital gains and not income. But that's a story for a different video. Then there's the fiscal headroom. Reeves has more than doubled it to £21.7 billion, which sounds technical, but after the Liz Truss chaos, it really matters. As I've talked about previously, Jeremy Hunt brought this all the way down to 10 billion. Getting it back to having proper buffers against economic shocks gives the government breathing room and hopefully will reassure markets. So these are good decisions, which makes what comes next more frustrating, bringing us on to the bad. So here's what's going to create the £26 billion of extra tax in 2029/30. So look at this chart. See the massive bar at the top? That's fiscal drag. 8 billion from freezing tax thresholds. The second bar is the taxes on pension contributions, another 4.7 billion that will be hitting workers. And then look at the wealth section. In particular, see that tiny stub? That's the much talked about mansion tax for 400 million. Here's what that actually means. Workers pay 13.5 billion, wealth pays less than 5 billion. Workers are paying nearly 3 times what wealth is paying in a Labour budget. Fiscal drag. Well, the Conservatives froze personal allowance and national insurance thresholds from 21 to 28. Labour are extending that freeze for another 3 years until April 2031. Politically, it's clever because it's hard for the Tories to attack it when they did the same thing. But economically, completely mad. Frozen sounds harmless. It's not. While inflation erodes the value of these thresholds, workers effectively move into higher tax brackets without any actual pay rise. You're paying more tax just for standing still. And here's the madness. You're building the biggest revenue raiser on a factor you don't control. You don't know what inflation will be over the next 6 years. That your largest tax measure is a bet on economic forces outside of your power. That's not fiscal planning. It's a punt. This is massive stealth tax on working people, and it's quite clearly the opposite of progressive taxation. So for decades, we made income tax more progressive by raising the personal allowance, taking the lowest earners out of tax entirely. It was actually something the Liberal Democrats did in coalition, where the government drove the personal allowance from 6,500 in 2010 to 10,600 by 2015, lifting millions of the lowest paid workers out of income tax completely. It was genuinely progressive policy, designed to help low-income families coming out of the Great Recession. Now, let me show you what fiscal drag means in real money. I don't think this has been explained that well so far. The £10,600 threshold in 2015 would be worth about £13,800 in today's money if it had kept pace with inflation. Instead, it's been frozen and it now sits at £12,600. With the OBR forecasting inflation averaging around 2% through to 2031, by the time the freeze ends, that threshold will only be worth about £11,200 in today's prices. Workers in 2031 will effectively have a personal allowance worth $2,600 less in real terms than they should have. That's not a freeze, that's just a real terms pay cut disguised as a technical adjustment. And what does this mean in actual tax? Well, for someone on a median earning of £35,000 a year, that eroded threshold means they'll be paying another £250 more in tax every year by 2031. For higher rate taxpayers, on say £55,000 a year, it's worse. They're going to be paying over £1,000 extra per year because both the personal allowance and the higher rate threshold are frozen. Multiply that across millions of workers and you see why this is the biggest revenue raiser in the budget. It's raising $8 billion a year by 2030, 20 times what the mansion tax brings in. Fiscal drag reverses decades of progressive policy. It's fundamentally regressive taxation, putting proportionately more pressure on lower earners whilst the wealthy barely notice. And it's raising billions whilst Labour pretends it's not a tax increase and claims that they haven't broken their manifesto not to raise taxes on working people. But fiscal drag isn't the only way this budget hits workers whilst avoiding wealth. And that brings us on to student loan repayment thresholds. Frozen for 3 years from April 27, so young workers already facing the highest housing costs in generations, already struggling to save, get squeezed further. Combined with fiscal drag, millennials and Gen Z are getting hit twice, once through income tax, once through student loan repayments. Then there's the pension salary sacrifice cap. From April 29, only the first £2,000 of salary sacrificed into pensions will get national insurance relief. Now there's a fairness argument here about higher earners benefiting disproportionately, but this adds complexity instead of removing it, and attacks sensible financial planning by people trying to save for retirement. And notice the timing on these things. Student loan freeze, not until 2027. Pension cap, 2029. Pushing the pain beyond the next election while claiming fiscal responsibility now. All of this highlights the insanity of our tax system. Why do we have national insurance and income tax as separate systems? We should have one truly progressive income tax that people actually understand, and one that pensioners pay too, instead of this bizarre arrangement where workers get hit twice while retirees pay neither national insurance nor student loans because they didn't have them. Merge them into one transparent system and you'd expose exactly who's paying what, and that's the kind of structural reform this budget should have pursued. But see the pattern. Fiscal drag hits workers. Student loan freeze hits young workers. A pension cap hits people trying to save as they work. None of these touch wealth. None of them ask anything of people sitting on assets. Which brings us to the elephant. Actually, elephants. There are several elephants crowding this room. Wealth inequality, growing, undeniable, and barely addressed. That's something Gary Stevenson talk about a lot. There's our relationship with Europe, the trade barriers and growth costs that are only really acknowledged on Wednesday by Sir Ed Davey. But this is a channel about tax and fiscal policy. So let's focus on the elephant that explains why this budget keeps squeezing workers instead of fixing the structural problems, and why no one ever really feels like they're benefiting from it. Here's the uncomfortable truth. We have more people retired for longer, needing expensive adult social care, supported by fewer workers. The service that today's retirees need simply weren't adequately funded when they were working. And that wasn't a moral failing, but it's a demographic reality that we didn't plan for. The numbers are brutal. The working age population is shrinking relative to the retired population. Adult social care costs are rising fast. And the OBR knows this, the Treasury knows this, everyone in government knows this, but no one will say it because the conversation that follows is politically impossible. The conversation would acknowledge that the wealthiest people in our society, many of whom happen to be retired, are sitting on assets while workers face stealth taxes. Property wealth accumulated during decades of house price growth, final salary pensions that younger generations can't access, investment income taxed more lightly than earned income until this budget at least started to make some small improvements in fixing that. I want to be absolutely clear. Many pensioners are vulnerable and need protection. The state pension really matters. Care for those who can't afford it really matters. This isn't about attacking pensioners or declaring intergenerational warfare, but we also need to acknowledge that the wealthiest retirees sitting on a £500,000 house, drawing a generous pension, substantial savings, are being asked for a lot less than workers on £30,000 or £40,000 a year who are getting hit constantly by this fiscal drag. That's not sustainable. It's not fair to workers. It's not even fair to vulnerable pensioners, because when the whole system collapses under the weight of unfunded care costs, they're the ones who'll suffer most. We need cross-party talks on social care funding. We need to look at everything. Wealth taxation, property tax reform, means testing for the wealthy, not to punish anyone, but to make the system sustainable for everyone, including for our children and grandchildren who will be asked to fund a system that's already creaking. You want to see the elephant's shadows? Well, look at the mansion tax. Labour's new tax on properties over 2 million will raise 400 million in total per year, which is trivial in a £1 trillion budget. But it's worse because it's performative politics that blocks real reform. Britain's property tax system is broken. Council tax uses 1991 valuations. A Mayfair flat can pay less than a Manchester semi. It is regressive, it's unfair, and it's ripe for overhaul. Proper property tax reform, based on current values with progressive rates, could raise substantial revenue fairly, but it's hard and it would require political courage. So instead, Reeves went for a mansion tax, raising this tiny amount but keeping the Labour backbenchers happy, ultimately ensuring the rotten system stays in place for another decade. I think it's the perfect symbol for this budget. You perform concern about inequality while avoiding the hard reforms that would actually address it in a sustainable way. This budget had the political capital and the fiscal space, it turned out, to have harder conversations. Labour did win a substantial majority, but they're not using it. They have fortunately lifted the headroom now to 20 billion. They have finally lifted the two-child benefit cap, but they could have told the truth. We need substantial funding for adult social care, meaning those with the most wealth, regardless of age, must contribute fairly and a bit more. We need real property tax reform, not gimmicks. We need to stop hitting workers through stealth taxes whilst protecting the asset rich. But instead, Rachel Reeves chose the easiest path she could find. And the elephants remain. Wealth inequality, Europe, our demographic time bomb. All studiously ignored in this budget. Until we acknowledge them, until some government has the courage to face these structural challenges, every budget will look like this one. Workers squeezed through fiscal drag and other stealth taxes. Young people hit twice, if not 3 times. Pensioners told that everything's fine until the care crisis arrives. Everyone pretending the sums add up. They don't, and the elephants are still there, and the mess they're making is only going to get bigger. If you did find this useful or interesting, share, like and subscribe. It really helps the algorithm, shows that more people do care about getting our tax system fixed. And next time, I plan to do a bit more of a deep dive into national insurance and income tax, the insane system that means workers get taxed twice and pensioners don't, and how we could build something that actually people understand. I hope to see you then. I'm Jamie from Accounts. I still believe that if we fix tax, we can fix Britain. Thank you.